The 15th verse picks up. It says, So when they had dined, Jesus saith to Simon Peter, Simon, son of Jonas, lovest thou me more than these? He saith unto him, Yea, Lord, thou knowest that I love thee. He saith unto him, Feed my lambs. He saith to him again the second time, Simon, son of Jonas, lovest thou me? He saith unto him, Yea, Lord, thou knowest that I love thee. He saith unto him, Feed my sheep. He saith unto him the third time, Simon, son of Jonas, lovest thou me? Peter was grieved because he said unto him the third time, Lovest thou me? And he said unto him, Lord, thou knowest all things. Thou knowest that I love thee. Jesus said unto him, Feed my sheep. Verily, verily, I say unto thee, when thou wast young, thou girdest thyself, and walkest whither thou wouldest. But when thou shalt be old, thou shalt stretch forth thy hands, and another shall gird thee, and carry thee whither thou wouldest not. This spake he, signifying by what death he should glorify God. And when he had spoken this, he saith unto him, Follow me. And we'll stop right there. That's about midway of this lesson. So, again, the scene is they're on the beach or the shore of the Sea of Galilee, having an evening meal. And to me, I visualize they're kind of, gathered around this little fire, and Jesus is in the midst of them. Now, you get into Acts, they're still, they're absorbing one, that he is risen, but they still have some ideas about what's going to take place that isn't particularly the way it's going to be, or at least by our timeline. But what we have recorded here is this discussion, dialogue between Jesus and Simon Peter. The question, Simon, son of Jonas, he is specific. In Matthew chapter 16, he speaks to Peter, Simon Bar-Jonah, which that's the same thing here. He is very specific. He is speaking to Peter. He's calling him by his full name. When you were young, being raised, and your mama called you by your full name, what did that mean?
Trouble.
It was serious.
Especially all 5 of them. She'd just go down the list.
And yeah, it was serious.
Very.
And not so much that Peter here was in trouble, but it was a matter of getting attention. This is important. Lovest thou me more than these? This is the first question. We'll see a little variation in these questions here. But the very first one, lovest thou me more than these? These meaning the other disciples. Because here's this band. For one thing, Jesus knew he was going to leave. So, Peter, do you love me more than you love these? Are you going to be persuaded perhaps by what some of these other disciples might think? That's kind of human nature, isn't it? Whoever you're around, why that has an influence on you. And if you, in this case, Peter, if he loved Jesus more than the others, to me, that would be a measure of stability and firmness that Peter needs to show here. Because I don't know if you see it in here, you probably do, but we're going to come up to something that relates back a little bit. But lovest thou me more than these? His answer, Yea, Lord, thou knowest that I love thee. Well, easy to say, isn't it? How many people? I mean, just keep it in, church people, saved people that's, involved in the church. And do you love the Lord? Oh yeah, I love the Lord. So I've heard that said in church, oh, I just love Jesus more than anything else, and I just love everybody because I love Jesus. And before they're out of the building, they're gossiping about somebody or, backbiting or whatever. That is lip service. But here he says, feed my lambs. Now Jesus uses the example of sheep, especially in John here. John 10 is a good example. We studied the flock and the shepherd and the relationship and so forth. And we find that all over into the epistles, and actually Peter himself will refer to sheep in his writings, in his epistles, as far as as a child of God. So it's a good example, a good illustration is these sheep. So then he says, 16th verse, he saith to him again, the second time, Simon, son of Jonas. My tongue's getting awful twisted up tonight. Simon, son of Jonas, lovest thou me? Now you notice the question is shorter, more pointed. Do you love me? He saith unto him, this is Peter, Yea, Lord, thou knowest that I love thee. Again, the same answer. But if you ask someone a question a second time, again, we're looking at stability. We're looking at being firm. We're looking at being unmovable, anchored. Peter's response, or the Lord's response to Peter, he saith unto him, feed my sheep. I know there's a lot of times I've heard messages, and I probably use it myself. You have lambs, is many times illustrated as the young convert, a sheep as those that have been saved a while, has more experience in the service of the Lord. They both need to be fed. And that's true. That's true. But he says here, first feed my lambs. Next he says, feed my sheep. Now, he saith unto him the third time. Now, put yourself in Peter's shoes here. 3 times. Simon, son of Jonas, lovest thou me? Peter was grieved because he said unto him the third time, lovest thou me? Now, this is repetitive. The third time, it's like, Lord, I've answered you twice already on this, but I see something a little bit deeper in this than just a matter of repetition. Any thoughts on that?
Well, didn't Peter deny him 3 times before the cock crowed?
That's right. Back in the 18th chapter, and the other Gospels for that matter, 3 times that he denied Jesus. And here, 3 times, Jesus, you love me? I said that he grieved because of that. And I think it's more than just the fact that he kept asking him the questions, but this third time brought back a memory that I'm sure Peter was trying to put behind him. I mean, that would be just human nature for one thing, to try to put that was a bad occasion. And it grieved him. But I think it got his attention. Who does he love? He really did love Jesus. I believe he did. But his answer, he said, And he said unto him, Lord, thou knowest all things. In other words, you know that I love you. Because you know all things. That, for one thing, that simple statement, and of course he goes ahead and affirms it again. He says, thou knowest that I love thee. But when he says, thou knowest all things, he is, in that sense, confessing or professing to Jesus as who he is, the Christ, as being the Christ, as being the Son of God, having that within him that he knows what's in Peter's heart. He knows what's going on. He knows all things. Because God knows all things. Now, Peter here didn't know all things. These other disciples didn't know all things. We don't know all things. But he acknowledges here to Jesus, you know all things. So this is an affirmation of what Peter had spoken, back in the 6th chapter of John. Thou hast the, word, can we go? Thou hast the words of life. In other words, a profession there of you're the one that has life. Matthew 16, that thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. I'm sure there's probably some other occasions that Peter here is affirming his previous professions. And Lord, you know my heart. That's one thing to say something. I mean, people can tell me whatever. I can't look in their heart. We can't look in someone else's heart. We might, by the tone of the voice, we might draw some conclusions. By their countenance, we might draw some conclusions or opinions, but we really can't look in their heart for sure. Jesus can. That's the difference. So he was making I think a very firm statement here when that he responded. Yes, he was grieved, but it brought back a memory, and it stirred him inside, and it brought him to the point that he says to him that, Lord, thou knowest all things. Again, what he is saying is, you know my heart. You know that I love you, but he again professes his love for Jesus. And Jesus saith unto him, feed my sheep. Again, at each time that the question is asked, do you love me? Feed my lambs, feed my sheep. What is it that Jesus is trying to get across to Peter here? What is it to feed the sheep?
Spread the gospel.
Oh, it got quiet, didn't we?
Oh, the word.
No.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Peter and the other disciples for that matter, but Peter here I think is really singled out because what did Jesus tell him about the denial? He said, Satan desired to sift you, to test you. And we know what all happened. And, Peter comes out on kind of the bad end of things there. Because he did. He denied, just as he said, Lord, I'll die with you. No, Jesus said, I know what's going to happen. You're going to deny me. The Lord used that experience and this experience, and then we find who was the main spokesman on the day of the Feast of Pentecost when the church was empowered. It was Peter. He was molded and formed just like the clay. And what was his primary purpose, as well as the others for that matter, but we're thinking on Peter here, was to feed the flock. I always talk about the pastor needs to feed the flock. It's not a matter of getting up and telling some stories of what's happened in the past or anything like that. It's getting into the Word and preaching the Word, because where is our nourishment? You know, it needs to be accompanied by the Holy Spirit. But it's the Word accompanied by the Holy Spirit. For Peter to feed the Lord's sheep. Notice it says, feed my lambs. That's Jesus. He says, you feed my lambs. You feed my sheep. That's a responsibility. A great responsibility. To give that nourishment, because if you look at the example given here, you have a flock of sheep, and you, for one thing, you feed them half of what they need, what's going to happen? They're going to be all thin and scrawny, perhaps even sickly, because they're not getting the nourishment, enough nourishment that they need. You feed sheep something that is against their physical, you know, how they assimilate food and everything, something that would make them sick. I mean, any of us, physically, if we eat something that makes us sick, I'm thinking of mangoes in your case, it's not good. You know, people have allergies on things. Peanut butter, a lot of people are allergic to peanuts. Well, the illustration here, you have a herd of sheep and you feed them something that is not good for them to eat, it's going to make them sick, if not kill them. So it's very important, one, to realize, he said, feed my sheep. They're Christ's sheep. They're not my sheep or any pastor's sheep. They weren't Peter's sheep. They're the Lord's sheep. That makes it important. And also the duty or the work to be done is to feed, not to, you know, hit with a stick or prod, or to, you know, scratch them behind the ear, but to feed, that they might grow and they might develop the best that they can. So there's some important things that are being taught here, is what I'm seeing. But he's still got some lessons to learn. But in the 18th verse, he says, verily, verily, this is Jesus speaking to Peter. He says, I say unto thee, when thou wast young, thou girdest thyself and walkest whither thou wouldest. But when thou shalt be old, thou shalt stretch forth thy hands, and another shall gird thee and carry thee whither thou wouldest not. Okay, looking at that face value, you know, anyone physically, I mean, when you get old physically, you wind up needing some help, don't you? You know, we see a lot of people today, they have, you know, caretakers, and they're there to help them. And sometimes it's maybe not exactly the way or the manner that you want it, but, you know, they're there to help and assist, to keep you going. Well, here again, this next verse is going to tell us this has a little deeper than just the fact that, well, Peter, when you get old, why, you know, you were young, well, you did pretty much what you wanted. You had the strength, the vitality. When you get old, why, you know, somebody else is going to take care of you. He says in the 19th verse, this spake he, signifying, which means that he's explaining here, or pointing out, referring to, by what death he should glorify God. And when he had spoken this, he saith unto him, follow me. So he's referring to the type of death that Peter was to die. In other words, it wasn't the type of death that he or anybody probably would plan. Now, tradition, and we take this for what it's worth, but tradition says that Peter was crucified upside down. And that makes a nice story when you consider that his, you know, he was judged, and that the execution was declared to be by crucifixion. And the story goes that he pleaded to be crucified upside down because he was not worthy to be crucified as his Lord. Now that's what I call historical tradition. And that may be true. It may not. There may be a kernel of truth in there. But whatever it amounted to, it says here that when thou shalt be old, thou shalt stretch forth thy hands, and another shall gird thee and carry thee whither thou wouldest not. It wasn't anything that he would willingly ask for. We know that what we read in Acts, he was imprisoned several times. He suffered persecution, as well as the other disciples and the apostles. But one thing, when it says signifying by what death he should glorify God, kind of gives some credence to the idea of, yes, he did die by crucifixion. Plus the fact, John, of the apostles, where does John fit in the apostles?
Well, he was kind of the favorite one, wasn't he?
I'm thinking of the order of who lasted. We find John on the Isle of Patmos when he receives the revelation.
Yeah, lived all the other disciples.
He was the last one.
Yeah.
And this was, John wrote this, is what we're going to see here, that he penned it down. He would no doubt have known how Peter died. He doesn't just put it in black and white here. There's some things that maybe are not that clear, but it's clear enough. And John, of anybody, would have known because he was the last of the apostles. And Jesus says to Peter there, follow me. And in the, let's see, that's in the 19th, and we go back. No, we're going to go ahead. Not there yet. He's going to tell Peter twice to follow him. Okay? Any thoughts on this first part here? Like I say, to me, it contains quite a bit of teaching and ideas to be drawn from it. Okay, the 20th verse. Then Peter, turning about, seeth the disciple whom Jesus loved following, which also leaned on his breast at supper, and said, Lord, which is he that betrayeth thee? Okay, who do you suppose that is?
John.
That's John. So, kind of what the picture here is, they've had their meal, they're walking along the shore, Jesus is talking with Peter, John is following, and Peter, after everything that Jesus asks him the question, speaks to him and so forth, concludes with saying, follow me, while Peter turns, and here's John. Peter, seeing him, saith to Jesus, Lord, and what shall this man do? I think we all pretty much have an idea on that question. The Lord had just spoken to Peter about what's going to happen to him. He turns and sees John and says, well, what about him? Are we supposed to really worry about what about him in the sense of curiosity, what's going to become of him? We may know what's going to become of us. What's going to become of him?
That's typical Peter.
I think we all have a little Peter in us. And what's Jesus say then? The answer, 22nd verse. Jesus saith unto him, if I will that he tarry till I come, what is that to thee? Follow thou me. Okay, in the 19th verse, when he kind of concluded his little dialogue there, conversation with Peter, he says, follow me. That's what Peter was supposed to do, was follow Christ. Isn't that what we're all supposed to do? So, what's he going to be doing? What's going to happen to him? And Jesus, you know, in a sense here, he says, why is that your concern? You know, what happened to John? Why are you concerned about that? His focus needs to be, and what was the first question that he asked? Do you love me more than these others? John, or Peter, what's your concern about John here? If he lives till I come back, what's that to you? You know, and really that's probably a pretty good lesson for a lot of people in church to ponder and meditate on, you know. Some people like to know every little detail of everything, of everybody else's business. And granted, Paul writes to the Philippians to care for one another and look at other people's concern as far as be concerned about them and their welfare. But he didn't tell them to be a busybody in other people's business either. So there's a difference. So, if I will that he tarry till I come, what is that to thee? I think, as we look into Acts, we don't see all the details, but what happened with the apostles is kind of what we get there. They scattered out, didn't they? Peter, in, I forget if it's the first or second epistle, I'll have to look it up, but in one of his epistles, Peter speaks about being in Babylon. Well, a lot of commentators and even I've heard preacher brethren that they say, well, that is kind of a code word that was used for Rome. Of course, you know, they get Peter into Rome. Well, what I have read in history, and here again, this we don't know for sure. One of those things we put on our list. I have a big long list for Paul. My list isn't quite so long for Peter, but I've got a list for him. Were you in Babylon the city, or were you in Rome? And we know Babylon is used figuratively for Rome. But at this time, there was a larger Jewish community in the city of Babylon than there was in Jerusalem and Judea. So it would be very possible. I mean, Peter was apostle to who? To the people.
Are Gentiles?
That's Paul.
Oh. What'd you ask?
Peter. I mean, there's one place in there where it was kind of agreed, you know, one would go to the Gentiles and the other would go to the Jews. And Peter pretty much preached to the Jews. And I'm sure he preached the gospel to whoever would listen, because for one thing, he was the first that preached to Gentiles, to the house of Cornelius, comes to mind. So it wasn't, you know, and Paul, when he was sent out to the Gentiles, he preached to the Jews. So, you know, he preached the gospel, but there was a specific work that had a little more weight to it. Say for Paul, because the Lord said, I'm sending you to the Gentiles. I feel that Peter had a little heavier burden for his own people, the Jews, and perhaps was even more comfortable with the Jews in preaching to them. Even though both, if we compare Peter and Paul, preached the gospel to whoever would listen. So, again, that's whether Peter actually wound up in Babylon or not, we'll ask him when we get over yonder. But the thing is, what we gather from the book of Acts is that all the apostles were scattered to different locations. So whether John went to Asia, which apparently he did because of where we pick up with John as far as the location, when he received his revelation on the Isle of Patmos, which is off the coast of what we refer to as Asia Minor and not too far from Ephesus. Anyway, so he closes the 22nd verse. He simply says, "Follow thou me." I told you that before. I'm telling you a second time. Follow me. And that's important for all of us. Keep in mind, follow him. Then went this saying abroad. Here we go. This is a good group of Baptists, I tell you. Then went this saying abroad among the brethren, that disciple, which is John, should not die. Yet Jesus said not unto him, he shall not die, but if I will that he tarry till I come, what is that to thee? Now, being this is in reference to John, I mean, John knew what went on there, what was said. But when it begins, then went out this saying abroad among the brethren. So what does that tell you?
Well, they didn't get the story straight.
Didn't get the facts straight. They heard.
What he said is not what they heard.
That's that's rumors, or they.
Misspoke.
I wasn't eavesdropping, but I heard, and that's why I say pretty good group of Baptists there.
This sounds like us.
And others.
But John takes this occasion to set the record straight, because at this time, and the writing of the Gospel of John compared to the how many of the apostles was left, he could have been by himself as far as the original apostles, or perhaps there was one or two, just a few that were left. But this was down the road a ways, and this had become, here's second generation, third generation, and the family thing of people that grew up under the gospel, was saved, part of the Lord's church. And here's this old man that's over here in Ephesus, this John the apostle. Why, I heard he wasn't going to die till the Lord comes back. Now think how that would, the ones that were here, and what we would call the first generation of the Christians, the followers of Christ, they would have perhaps a little different angle on it. But you go down the ways, little time and distance, and this rumor could become very strong. Just like some of the traditions that has developed over the years amongst churches, that, boy, you go in and you see it's a tradition. It's not really scriptural. Maybe it's a tradition that doesn't matter one way or another as far as helpful or hurtful, but it's a tradition that it's not a tradition, it's a doctrine. And will have its entire backing of scriptures that's been found to back that doctrine. We've discussed, that you don't take a doctrine and then find scriptures to support it. You study the scriptures and find the doctrine it teaches. So, again, John was, I think, taking occasion here to set things straight for generations that would come. Any thoughts or questions, comments on that? Boy, it gets quiet. 24th verse. This is the disciple which testifieth of these things and wrote these things, and we know that his testimony is true. What does that verse say? Let's condense it down in 10 words or less. Whose gospel is it?
John.
Who wrote the gospel?
John.
John.
Who is testifying here of the validity of this gospel?
John.
No?
No.
Yeah, that's,
Oh,
I'm
and when it
just,
says we, it's like.
I'm just being theatrical.
And when it says, and we know that his testimony is true, we as in me, myself, and I.
That's right. And everybody, because everybody knew this was written by John.
Yeah, I was just gonna say,
Yeah.
I think it was all the other ones that knew this was true.
Yeah, he was doing as Paul does in his writings many times. He'll say we or us or something along that line. He includes himself in those that receive the letter. That's what John is doing here. And you know this is, I'm John, I'm the writer of this gospel. I have seen this, what I'm writing about. I know what I'm writing about. And you know what I'm writing is true. Because until the time that this was penned down, the New Testament, what did they have for a New Testament? We might say, what did they have for a Bible? They had the Old Testament, the Law and the Prophets, Psalms, and they had the Apostles. If you had a question, what did Jesus teach until this was written down as we have it, you went to an apostle. And you would ask John, what did Jesus say about this? And what did Jesus tell his disciples on the night before the crucifixion? When the Spirit of truth is come, he will guide you and teach you to all truth. So, until this was pinned down, they indeed have the living Bible because it was the apostles. But as the apostles begin to die off, and during this period of time that they were dying off, is the time that we find these scriptures recorded so that it will go on. So John affirms his authorship and the truth of what he's writing. And then the 25th verse, and there are also many other things which Jesus did, the which if they should be written, every one, I suppose that even the world itself could not contain the books that should be written. Amen. The previous chapter ends the 30th and 31st verse of the 20th chapter. And many other signs truly did Jesus in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written that ye might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that ye and that believing ye might have life through his name. In those verses, he begins saying pretty much the same thing as what he's saying here. The magnitude of recording the teachings and the acts and the works of Jesus Christ here in this 21st verse. The world itself could not contain the books. We're talking about actual recording here. In the 20th chapter, John gives the purpose of the writing of this, as well as stating that there's a lot more that's not recorded. But what was the purpose? What is the purpose that we have this entire book? That we might believe. And that in believing, and as we believe what is in these, the covers of this book, that we might live. live the life that God wants us to, live in a relationship with God, live in fellowship with God. And again, I like this. I suppose that even the world itself, back then they didn't really know how large the expanse of the earth was. But they knew it was big. And that's what he's saying here. There could not contain the books that should be written. To me, that just expresses the magnitude of Christ, the glory of Christ, the greatness of Christ, and all that he's done. We can study and we think, well, he came to this world, he lived in this world, he taught, he had miracles, he went to the cross, buried, risen, ascended. We kind of scrunch it down, but really, as we study this, the more you study, the bigger it gets. Or that's with me. The more, there's verses time and time again I study and read it over, and there's something, maybe it's a reference that goes somewhere else to some scripture, but there's a thought, whatever, it just gets bigger.